Our speaker tonight is Peter Moore. Peter's talk tonight is entitled South Australian Lawyers and the First World War. Although Peter has lived in New South Wales for many years, he spent his formative years in Adelaide. He was educated at Ross Trevor College and graduated in law at the University of Adelaide and was admitted to the practice of the Supreme Court of South Australia in 1977. He later trained as an archivist. Peter has had a long association with the Historical Society of South Australia, in fact longer than mine, Peter. He was a foundation member back in 1974. He served on the council in 1977 and is a life member of the Society. Peter is at present researching the history of South Australian legal profession from 1837 to 1945. And tonight he's going to talk about a portion of that research, namely the lawyers who were involved in World War I. Thank you, Peter. Now, I'm not quite sure if we do a good thing.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the introduction. The first wave of Australians onto the beach at Anzac Cove included 2 private soldiers, a young solicitor and an articled law clerk. In the rush up the ridge, the solicitor got as far as any in his section, further than any Australian that day, by the articled clerk's telling. This is number 1 section, number 1 platoon, as you can see. The articled clerk, Guy Fisher, is standing 3rd from the left, and Arthur Blackburn, you can scarcely see, squatting down in the front. The picture came from the Advertiser in 1978, very poor, but it's a group of the people who subsequently formed part of that number 1 section. The solicitor, Arthur Blackburn, the articled clerk, Guy Fisher, both from Adelaide, were university chums sharing digs in Unley. They queued together at exhibition camp a fortnight after war was declared, and together they embarked 8 weeks later with South Australia's first war contingent. Both men lived to tell the tale. Blackburn went on to fight in France and won a Victoria Cross at Pozières. Fisher was wounded that first Anzac Day and evacuated to Egypt. The next year he joined the British artillery. Both men, captains, returned to Adelaide and practiced law till their deaths in the 1960s. Brigadier Blackburn headed the RSL. Captain Fisher became a leader of the Red Cross. Exceptional service, estimable lawyers, intertwined lives. In this paper, I present a hidden facet of AIF history, that of South Australian men who signed the Supreme Court roll and who saw active military service in the Great War. On 2 counts, the study is timely. First, Australia's enduring regard for the Anzac tradition reaches its annual exaltation within the fortnight. And second, analysis of the AIF by vocational groupings is still rare, and none of it South Australian. The legal profession answered the call to arms from the start. From the declaration of war in August 1914 to the armistice in November 1918, over 1/3 of the state's legal practitioners of military age proved willing to enlist. Nearly 1/3, 50, of its military-age lawyers enlisted for duty in a theatre of war. 42 embarked with the AIF, 6 in British forces, and 1 in the French army. A further 5 pre-war members of the military forces served at home and abroad in military and associated capacities. At least 7 practitioners tried to enlist, but were rejected on medical grounds. Another enlisted, but was held back by his employer. Thus, a total of 62 current practitioners sought or obtained military service. I'm going to restrict my remarks to admitted practitioners. That means I'll omit 62 law students and assorted law clerks, men like Guy Fisher, who did not commence legal practice until after the war. This photograph of the law faculty students of 1906, with Darry Darenberg, their lecturer, in the back with the moustache, is a representative sample of the selection pool for the AIF of a decade later. Bottom left, seated, is Stuart Ronald. Front right, standing, is Bertram Penny. In the middle row, next to the man leaning on the stonework, is Reginald Riddell. Top right, seated, is Leslie Haslam. Top right, standing, is George Cowan. And 8 more people who served actually missed out on the photograph that day. So a really serious representative sample of the group who in 1906 had nothing on their minds but pranks on Commemoration Day and getting down to legal practice. and most of them did both, I assure you. South Australia's AIF lawyers fit the profile of a white-collar urbanised force better than that of any mythic bushman army. Not even 5 country practitioners served to change that. Lawyers were perhaps unlikely soldiers. All were denizens of urban offices. Most were well established, with half having more than 5 years in practice. Nearly 2/3 were principals in firms, partners rather than employed solicitors. Their standing in the profession ranked from a few days short of 18 years, in the case of Gordon Simpson, down to barely 4 months in the case of Harold Moody. Thomas Mellor was attached to the AIF a fortnight before his admission, and 9 were admitted during the war years. Like the AIF, most were South Australian born and trained, young, single, and Protestant. Unlike the AIF, most were products of private schools and universities. All but 6 were born in South Australia, 5 from other parts of Australia, 1 in England, 1 in Canada. And all but 5 were Adelaide residents. So definitely an urban group. The lawyers' cohort, though young, was a little older than the national average because none was under 21. Legal practitioners must, by rule of court, be at least 21 to be admitted, but you could be 18 to join the AIF. Moreover, more importantly, I think, twice as many legal volunteers were over 30 than the rest of the AIF. Recruitment policy began by taking the young and the single, and only later did it seek the older and the married. 3/5 were single at enlistment, and the 2/5 who were married mostly joined from mid-1916, consistent with the national trend. The call to arms entwined around personal lives. Thomas Griffith married just before enlisting, Leslie Haslam on enlistment, Eric Milhouse just before signing on, Frank Williams before going into camp, and Frederick McBride just before embarking. Harry Thompson was engaged, and Lewis Whitington left behind a sweetheart. Confessional Anglicans exceeded non-Anglican Protestants by only a small margin, if nothing else consistent with South Australia's unique history. 4 Catholics in the contingent amounted to half the national average. A strong majority attended private schools, not just the colleges you might know by name, but Queen's College, North Adelaide Grammar, and a couple of others. AIF volunteers were all products of Adelaide University, while some of the British commissions were held by people graduating at Oxford and 2 at Cambridge. For educational level, the lawyers were, predictably, well above the national average. The legal cohort surpassed the expectation that the AIF would blend numerous new recruits with a liberal salting of experienced soldiery from existing military forces. A good third of the law's cohort had pre-war military experience in citizen militias, school and university cadets, and in the ubiquitous rifle clubs that had for 50 years kept young males gun-ready for military take-up. 7 had trained with the South Australian military forces well before 1914 and were called up for duty. 2 of this group saw active service overseas. Thomas Mellor and Harold Moody were lieutenants in the Citizens' Artillery before the war and carried on that service in the AIF. 4 others served at home. Edward Padman and Leslie Stewart, both majors by August 1914, joined the colony's Scottish regiment, which had formed during the Boer War, and enrolled some practitioners then and more during the dozen years that followed. Major Stewart rose in rank with the regiment's rifles and then field battery units, and juggled the duties of Master of the Supreme Court and Army officer, taking over a year's leave from the court to command at Mitcham Camp. As he sat on the district selection committee which rejected some volunteers, he also headed up the Rejected Soldiers Association. Padman passed his major's examination the week before war broke out. He presided at standing court-martial for the 4th Military District and, attached to the AIF, made 2 voyages to war zones in 1915 and in 1918 to bring home the wounded and invalid soldiers. Padman practiced at Port Pirie. At Moonta, English-born Captain Seymour Page was a member of numerous organisations, including the local council. When he died in 1918, he received a military funeral. A 3rd country lawyer, Charles Mackenzie, directed the senior cadets and practiced law at Mount Gambier. He led recruiting parties in the southeast, followed by a year as an instructor at Duntroon Military College. In September 1918, he was formally called up to assist with the wind-up of the war. City man, Lieutenant Shirley Jeffreys, prosecuted at courts martials. The cadet system proved its worth as a recruiting agent for nearly half of the cohort. 5 cadets went on to join a military unit before enlisting in the AIF. Numbers belonged to rifle clubs at schools and university, especially in country districts and outer metropolitan areas. 40-odd legal people even formed their own legal rifle club in early 1915. including several too old or too young to serve, some already in military units, and quite a number who would soon enlist. You may be interested to know they formed in February 1915, and in May 1915 they lost a shootout with the Adelaide Ladies Rifle Club. 2/3 of the legal cohort were military freshmen, the first enlisted a fortnight after the outbreak of hostilities. Legal enlistments in the AIF picked up in tandem with the state's recruiting phases, 3 in 1914, 4 more by the end of 1915, and so on. And of course, June 1915 is when the worst of the news about the Gallipoli landings came home. July 1916 is when the devastating news of the massacre on the Somme came through. And both are crucial moments in the recruiting history of the AIF. 9 more enlistments after the Somme news more than held the legal cohort's own with the rest of the AIF before, like the AIF, or should I say like the rest of Australia, following a national downward trend with only handfuls in each of 1917 and 1918. None has left a record of his motive. Whatever it was, incipient Australian nationalism, empire loyalism, or that spirit of adventure admitted by others, it was certainly abstract. They could only imagine what would happen to them. Only one had any idea of what lay in store. Leslie Gordon had spent 2 years with the British unit in the Boer War, where he saw a lot of action, was wounded in 1901, broke a leg in 1902. Son of Adelaide magistrate James Gordon, nephew of both Justice Gordon at the Supreme Court and King's Counsel James Anderson, his career was at a turning point. His uncle Anderson, who had taken him into partnership at his admission and had died in 1913, left Leslie his own man. An experienced soldier, 30, single, he felt free to go. The AIF's reputation as a democratic army and the legal professions as an elite vocation might be thought to conflict. In fact, the majority of the AIF, and also its South Australian lawyers, embarked and returned as private soldiers. A core of legal people, of course, served as officers, both commissioned before embarkation and afterwards, in the field, and also as non-commissioned officers. 7 brought their commissions with them. 6 commenced their war service with British commissions. 10 freshmen embarked as officers. 5 more won field commissions. Freshman Angus Ferguson is an example. He began as a private with C Company at Mitcham Camp, passed the NCO course, and was promoted to sergeant in March 1916. During July and August, he attended an officers' school of instruction, all 2 months of them, and he was commissioned in October. He embarked the following February 1917. In England, another 6 weeks' intensive course prepared him for the trenches. 9 more had similar commissions: Gordon Campbell, Leslie Haslam, Arnold Malden, John Murray, Bertram Penny, Reginald Riddell, Stanley Skipper, Harry Thompson, and Lewis Whitington. 5 earned their commissions during the war. Arthur Blackburn left a private and won his lieutenant's commission at Gallipoli. Alfred Gifford embarked as a signals corporal and received his lieutenancy for the conduct that also won him the DSO. Corporal Patrick Olstrom and Private Flinders Mitchell, both infantrymen, and artillery driver Hugh Martin won their lieutenant's spurs in the field. Early in 1918, Private Howard Vaughan qualified as an NCO at an English school of instruction before being sent to France, and as the war came to an end, he was posted to the Education Service, and there he got his lieutenant's pips. 12 left with non-commissioned ranks. Leslie Gordon, who'd been a captain in the Boer War, went out as a sergeant. Quite a few took rank as lance corporal, corporal or sergeant for the voyage only, and then reverted to private status. Quite a number won their stripes while they were away. Frank Seymour Smith and Leslie Gordon and James Brown became staff sergeants. Eric Milhouse and Gordon Simpson came home regular sergeants. Henry Muirhead and William Pine as corporals, and so on. With embarkation orders, the send-offs began. The Supreme Court was always rich in its praise when enlisting practitioners who came before their honours. However, the profession itself does not appear to have lived up to its fraternal traditions by farewelling its own. Instead, departing legal warriors were honoured, but at community rather than professional events. Take William Denny, for example. Both members of both houses said their au revoirs to William Denny in the parliamentary dining room, when, amid wisecracks aplenty, the Speaker presented him, a member of the Irish Rifle Corps, with a bunch of shamrocks grown in the Botanic Gardens from seeds brought from Ireland. More practical was a pair of field binoculars. Another Irish South Australian, Collier Cudmore, was banqueted, and I'm sure far more soberly, by the Liberal Union at the Grand Central Hotel. A rare exception was the Law Students' Debating Society social for past and present members, departing for the front, held in July 1915 at Jackman's Cafe. Loyal toasts lauded the brave Belgians, denounced German atrocities, boldly talked up recruitment, and sadly recollected casualties already incurred. The Chief Justice, who had recently undergone an amputation of an arm, spoke as a one-armed man who would take up any weapon and die fighting, characterising the war as the greatest the world had ever known, and on our side the noblest war, and a war of truth and righteousness. Justice Sir John Gordon, practitioner Sir Josiah Simon KC, and article clerk Frank Hicks spoke in similar vein. Young practitioners and students replied, sang songs, recited poems, and above all listened. Names were read out of 10 practitioners at the front, 10 more in camp, 3 gone to England to enlist, and 3 killed. Not at that stage a practitioner, but clerks. First lawyer to join, first to go. Arthur Blackburn sailed with South Australia's first contingent aboard HMAT Ascanius from Port Adelaide in October 1914. Marching from Morphettville to the Adelaide Railway Station to entrain for Outer Harbour, Chief Justice Way numbered among numerous dignitaries who took their salute in King William Street. Among the crowds raising a last hurrah were, no doubt, the lawyers and clerks of Adelaide's legal precinct. Parliamentarians in both houses wished officers and men a prosperous voyage, brilliant service in the field, and a safe return to the Commonwealth. Happily, many of the law's soldiers enjoyed all 3. 50 lawyers then went into camp for basic training and allocation to the various branches of military life. Variety of backgrounds among practitioners corresponded with the variety of their allotted services. They echoed those of the AIF in general. Their work ranged from the trenches to headquarters, from stretcher bearers to artillery gunners. Being university educated, aptitude must have been high, if more about brain than brawn. Perhaps that explains why the majority, nearly half of the legal group, stayed in the main camps to prepare for life as foot soldiers. Several embarked and returned as privates. As you can see, quite a number came back as officers. A range of other services were entered. Leslie Gordon, Flinders Mitchell and Donald Kerr took on medical duties attached to field hospitals or ambulance units. Frank Williams from Cowell, enlisting as a solicitor and farmer, which I think is unprofessional, he could have been struck off, embarked in August as a private with the motor transport service in both England and in France. Lieutenant Stanley Skipper and William Denny joined the Light Horse, though neither saw much horseflesh in the fields of France. Denny, at 42 and 8 months, was one of the law's oldest recruits and quickly transferred to the 5th Division's artillery. His task was pack transport, in fact, delivering water near Ypres. Wounded in the right arm, he nevertheless got his load through, helped 2 wounded men to safety, then went to a dressing station to dictate his report to HQ. Evacuated to England, he worked on headquarters duties while convalescing. Stanley Skipper tried juggling practice with service, to the point of applying for a right of legal practice within Mitcham Camp. He did some courts-martial work, then 3 months officer training at Duntroon, all before shipping out in August 1918 to assist with post-war military administration. The legal cohort's most numerous service after the infantry lay behind the big guns, and that's the way probably they like to think of themselves. Thomas Mellor of the 34th Battery passed his lieutenant's exam the week before war broke out, called up immediately to assist in training the 1st Expeditionary Force. He shipped out with the AIF in August 1915. 2nd Lieutenant Moody went out as an observation officer with the ammunition train, saw 2 months' action on the Gallipoli Peninsula, and directed the removal of the guns of his battery the night before the evacuation. He then proceeded to the Western Front for round 2. Stanley Murray, with the artillery in France for the armistice, got his lieutenant's pips and then appointment as a divisional courts-martial officer. 8 went as gunners. Is it 8? Yeah. 3 more as drivers, most served in France, some in Egypt. Eric Milhouse, Spindley Webb, Rudolph Hoytzenroder were posted to musketry school at Cheltenham. Edwin Cox, Thomas Griffiths, Kevin Healy and Stanley Murray marched out to artillery brigades in Maribyrnong in Victoria. Harold Piper, ordered interstate about 3 weeks before his due date, was admitted early with the compliments of the full bench. A small group served in British forces. Hamer Greenwood, KC, I mentioned in a moment, and John Duncan Hughes and the others, all chose a British force to join. Hamer Greenwood is the most extraordinary case. He's probably the South Australian profession's least known practitioner, probably because he spent barely 3 hours in the jurisdiction after his admission. A Canadian attorney turned English barrister, MP, confidant of Lloyd George. He visited Sydney and Melbourne with an imperial parliamentary delegation during 1913 and was admitted to the Supreme Courts of New South Wales and Victoria and the High Court as a courtesy. He steamed into Adelaide by the Melbourne Express, was met by Chief Justice Way's carriage, whisked up to Montefiore for lunch, and whether it was the imperial spirit or the Australian wine, by 2 o'clock the full bench was sitting at the Supreme Courthouse. Sir John Downer, KC, moved that Greenwood be admitted. The court suspended the rules and so ordered, whereupon the new practitioner signed the roll, swore the oaths, and took a glass of sherry. Greenwood then caught the afternoon train to Outer Harbour in time to sail away on the evening tide, never to return. Adelaide did keep an eye on him, though, noting his brief command of a Welsh battalion on the Western Front and his subsequent recruiting work, not to mention 3 subsequent steps in the peerage. He was atypical. True practitioners, 5 of them, paid their own way to London because their loyalties lay with the mother country, or they wanted to avoid having to join the AIF as a private and take pot luck about allocation to a service. 3 hankered after big guns, joined the Royal Field Artillery. John Duncan Hughes had been at Cambridge, Collier Cudmore at Oxford, and called to the English bar at the Inner Temple before returning for a few years' practice in Adelaide. Both secured British commissions in the artillery and served in France. Cudmore was seriously wounded twice, saw out the war recovering in England. Duncan Hughes won the Military Cross and Belgian Croix de Guerre in 1918 and returned home a captain. Robert Davey, a judge's associate at the Supreme Court, feared that his citizen artillery unit would not see overseas service, so he took his CO's advice to join a British regiment. The court gave him immediate admission, especially as he promised to spend a year after the war at one of the barristers' temples in London. He spent 3 years in France with the artillery and afterwards with the British Air Service, but not, it seems, with one of the temples of the bar. Charles Simon revived a dormant commission in the Coldstream Guards to serve in the trenches. From Oxford and the Inner Temple, he too practised in Adelaide until he returned to England, the 4th of Sir Josiah Simon's sons to enlist. On the Somme for much of 1916, in a letter to his father, he quoted John Masefield of dodging death and danger without rest. Another letter quipped that we're winning all right, but when we get to Berlin it's not settled yet. Legal understatement, perhaps. The same pluck won him the Military Cross. 9 weeks before the armistice, he moved forward before an attack, showing himself to draw the fire of enemy machine guns, thereby locating their positions and bringing the information back to his men and saving numerous lives. But Francis Belt takes some cake for the daring do of the Ian Fleming kind. Son and brother of Adelaide lawyers, no meek small city attorney. This man, temperamentally ill-disposed to legal work, he went exploring in 1894 to the far north of the state, and in 1900 big game hunting in South Africa, moving, as one newspaper crassly put it, from shooting buffalo to boars. In 1914 he gained a command in the British Naval Reserve and saw command in naval armoured car squadrons in Belgium, Russia, Persia, Romania and Galicia. The French military service was honoured by the presence of Cecil Thomas Bray. Individual lawyers found ways to fight the war their own way. Cecil Bray fitted out his own car as an ambulance, offered it to the Australian military and the British, only to be knocked back by both. Undeterred, he shipped his modified vehicle to France and joined the French army, driving it for 17 months until it was a piece of old scrap, before returning unharmed himself in January 1917. For the range of bravery awards, the legal group achieved significant distinction. The profession's first royal honour was Alfred Gifford's DSO. Most often mentioned is Arthur Blackman's VC, one of 5 won by South Australians out of 63 in Australia as a whole. The Military Cross was won by Gordon Campbell, William Denny, Charles Simon, Harry Thompson and John Duncan Hughes. The Military Medal went to Donald Kerr. Blackburn and Denny had their medals pinned on by the King at Buckingham Palace. Thomas Mellor and Arnold Malden were each twice mentioned in dispatches and awarded the OBE just after the war. 4 South Australian lawyers lie in foreign fields. 3 killed in action outright, 1 died of wounds. Medical Corps Sergeant Clerk Leslie Gordon was killed at Gallipoli 3 months after the first landing. Harold Moody survived Gallipoli and the July slaughter on the Somme, only to die a month later of multiple bomb wounds received at Pozières. The legal cohort's next fatalities occurred within 7 months of the armistice. Infantrymen Flinders Mitchell and Angus Ferguson were killed in action on the Western Front in April and May, respectively. Mitchell fell to heavy machine gun fire at Dernancourt. And here is the marker, the little one on the left, put up by his colleagues as a temporary gravesite. As many again were seriously wounded and invalided home. Some wounded less seriously returned to duty. Several, wounded and evacuated twice, were not sent back to the front. Donald Kerr, infantry private on enlistment, acting sergeant in the Medical Corps at embarkation, spent his war career in the French mud of the Western Front. After 4 consecutive days of intense fighting in August 1916, he displayed conspicuous courage, endurance, and self-sacrifice, attending wounded men and carrying them in cheerfully and unceasingly until badly wounded himself. For this service he received the Military Medal and an early passage home. Gordon Simpson was wounded in Gallipoli. He'd practiced in Adelaide quite a while before heading back to Sydney, where his family lived, and in early April 1815, enlisting and embarking. But he'd not forgotten his old friends in Adelaide. He was injured, and from Gallipoli wrote a letter to the Adelaide papers saying, "Most anxious to hear from my old friends. Send letters addressed to C Company, 10th Platoon, 1st Infantry Battalion, 1st AIF, 1st Australian Division, Mediterranean Forces." William Pine was a week in France before he went down with tonsillitis, but he was soon in the thick of it, taking a gunshot wound to the face. Thomas Griffith was shell-shocked, deaf, and injured in the hand, and then got influenza. Walter Reed was also shell-shocked and evacuated to England, but he returned to headquarters duties in France before a medical board decided to send him home. One measure among many of the misery of trench warfare, various ailments laid low quite a number. Simpson was brought down by dysentery for several months in 1915 and even broke a collarbone on the evacuation voyage to Egypt. Bindley Webb at 38 got to the front but was hospitalised by a heart condition and soon returned to Australia. William Henderson from Victor Harbour was 2 months at the line before rheumatic fever laid him low, only to be invalided home. By 1918, you may well know, influenza was the disease of choice. Henderson was admitted 3 times in 9 months. Henry Muirhead and William Pine also suffered bouts. Howard Vaughan spent 4 months in care for influenza and bronchial asthma in 1918. So war is not just firing bullets from trenches. The Supreme Court itself lost staff. 5 judges' associates left their posts to enlist and serve abroad. An effort was made to pace their enlistments to avoid leaving the court badly understaffed. Robert Davey, Kevin Healy and Albert Bindley Webb joined up across 6 months of 1915. Frederick McBride in 1916, Geoffrey Reed in 1918. George Lidgettwood had replaced Major Stewart as master for well over a year, and as soon as Stewart was back, he enlisted and sailed away in August 1918, not reaching London until mid-October, but staying around to assist with the repatriation of Australian soldiers. A similar operational courtesy applied to Crown Law. Kevin Healy, an associate till his admission, afterwards became an assistant parliamentary draftsman, and he embarked in 1917 when Claude Martin had been recruited to fill the gap. This gave the high-profile Crown Solicitor and parliamentary draftsman Albert Hannon his chance, a crack shot with the Legal Rifle Club. Attorney General Peake gave him leave to enlist in early 1918. He cleared a good deal of pressing work before going into camp, but the next Attorney General arranged that he would have a 6-month leave pass, and by the time it expired, the war was over. Short of active service overseas or at home, lawyers did what they could to support the war effort. George McEwen's leadership of the Cheer Up Society was legendary by war's end. Others gave much and often to the Comfort Fund and the Soldiers' Fund. They also assisted serving men with legal problems. Talbot Smith earned the nickname Officer in Charge Wills. Not only did he devise a standard form for the AIF, but reputedly prepared 4,000 soldiers' wills free of charge. The Red Cross proved an enduring cause among lawyers. William Isbister took himself off to Egypt to reorganise the timely landing and more efficient distribution to the troops of all sorts of aids and comforts. Whilst he was there, he heard that he'd been appointed King's Counsel. The profession's own body, the Law Society, stepped into several novel roles. Like other Australian legal associations, the Law Society conducted the Red Cross Information Bureau that tracked the dead, wounded and missing for anxious families at home. 24 solicitors attended to nearly 10,000 telegrams and cables. And this is an example not only of a letter about a lawyer, it's about Ronald Stewart's location, it's signed by Charles Edmonds, and he was not only the Secretary of the Bureau, he was the Secretary of the Law Society. The Society, with the judges and magistrates, raised well over £500 for Belgian relief at the end of 1914 and a further £550 to pay for a field ambulance, a gesture that spurred several organisations to send about 16 more field ambulances away during 1915 alone. But it's to recruitment fervour during the war that I'll now turn, because it had a sting in its tail. This is Army Gordon, the nickname for Sir John Hannah Gordon, a Strathalbyn practitioner till he moved to Adelaide, then Attorney General, Silk, and a Supreme Court judge. He was the uncle of Leslie Gordon, who was killed at Gallipoli. The most visible and potent way for lawyers in mufti to help with recruiting was to beef up the recruiting effort. Nicknamed Army Gordon for something like 40 years, Justice Gordon protested in court one day, in April 1915, ironically, that not 1 in 10 young lawyers had enlisted. Well, from 4 over the previous 9 months, 14 enlisted in the next 9, so perhaps he had made his point. This is an example of hundreds of recruiting meetings. This one happens to have been attended by Patrick McMahon Glynn, KC, an Irish barrister who'd practiced in Kapunda. He was also a federal parliamentarian and took this role and spoke on many other occasions during that fortnight in what was the first great concerted recruiting program in the state. And what now would we give to hear Paris Nesbitt, KC, spruik up enlistment at Treasury Corner opposite Victoria Square, one of the great orators of the legal tradition. Going into camp notices in the daily papers noted who was offering themselves and who wasn't. It honoured those who were going in a very public way and, of course, encouraged more to follow. The trouble was that they also advertised those who did not. This one refers to, I think it's W.C. Holland, solicitor, in the third line there, yeah? So this is just one of many of these notices that turned up. Now, the issue of men who did not enlist bubbled beneath the surface throughout the war years. Not even the legal community was immune to the emotions it generated. Part of the problem was the enthusiasm for lists and leaving people out. You see, 7 practitioners tried very hard to don the khaki, only to be declared medically unfit for active service. George Cowan, admitted in 1911, was rejected in 1916, and in early 1918 sailed away to England at his own expense as the Red Cross Deputy Chief Commissioner of the Australian War Comforts Fund. And he took a very particular interest post-war in the men on war graves work. George Ewell, a founder member of the Legal Rifle Club, once he was rejected, returned to Sydney where his family had gone in 1916. James Regan practiced at Port Adelaide, the early part of the war, and then in Gladstone and Port Pirie in partnership with Major Edward Padman, whom we've heard of before. While at the port, acting for the Waterside Workers' Federation, he strongly urged the executive of the union to send the men back to end a major strike. Was that war work of a kind? The wharfies didn't comply. Alan Pinch at the Crown Law Office tried more than once but was rejected each time. 3 were rejected while still articled law clerks, and instead of serving in the AIF, went on to complete their preparation for admission. Frank Hicks took his law degree and was admitted in December of 1915. As a clerk and as a practitioner, he turned up at student events and spoke at patriotic occasions, sometimes quite controversially. Magnus Badger Jr. was rejected because of poor eyesight. Placed on the Home Service, he worked at a returned soldiers' camp at Cheltenham for several months in 1916 until the camp was itself demobilised. He took the hint and went back to his law studies and was admitted in April 1918. But when a 3rd articled law clerk, Kenneth Sanderson, was turned down, the scrutiny and the pressure of not enlisting or being seen to have enlisted led him to publicise the fact of his medical finding. What had happened was that a legal man calling himself Reject had corrected some recently published lists like these, but which were incomplete. And he wanted to prove how great the legal response had been, and pointed out that not more than half a dozen eligible unmarried lawyers belong to the slackers brigade. So the talk was hot and got nasty. Sanderson's reply to Reject explained his case and named 5 other rejected practitioners. The trouble was, both the lists, like these lists, were incomplete, misleading the public and offending those who were omitted. So the Supreme Court stepped in, diffused the tension by issuing an official list of practitioners and article clerks who had enlisted, as well as those who had been rejected. Before long, though, more lawyers came under renewed scrutiny when AIF enlistment policy changed to target married men and added to existing pressures and tensions. Take Rex Wallman, 29 at the outbreak of hostilities. He did not enlist early because his wife was expecting their first child. His older brother Hubert was a lieutenant in the Tunnelling Corps in France, and younger brother Arthur was a trooper with the 9th Light Horse in Palestine. Mrs. Wallman's brother was serving in France, indeed soon to be killed there. A few months after their son's birth, in April 1915, Rex's law partner, Claude Martin, joined up. He was single. Rex's decision at the time was perfectly acceptable. In Rex's case, though, something else was at play: his German background. Things were said to him and about him. I don't know what was said, and I don't know who said them, because Rex kept a very stern silence then and later. His Anglo-Irish patrician wife was less reserved, castigating anyone who impugned her family's patriotism. 18 pre-war practitioners of military age enjoyed German ethnicity. Only one had been born in Germany, and the parents of most of the others were themselves Australian-born. 2 with German names had Anglo mothers, and more with Anglo names had German mothers. Most had married Anglo women. German itself could be a matter of degree, and there was never any doubt where Wallman loyalties lay. By contrast, the Homburgs spoke German at home and sang Lieder around the piano. How German! Justice Homburg, on the Supreme Court bench, had died just before the war, and his sons continued to practice with his partner, Alec Melrose, from the Pastoral dynasty. And if they'd done so quietly, they might have survived unscathed, but both men were politicians. Herman, a South Australian-born lawyer of 18 years' standing, was Attorney General at the outbreak of the war. Herman the German went the sneer. His office was raided by the military at bayonet point in February 1915. He and his brother, another lawyer, Robert, the member for Borough, both resigned in 1915, ostensibly for professional and political reasons. Herman was sent into exile in Victoria under military watch. The ensuing demonisation of lawyers was partly led by a lawyer, Attorney General Howard Vaughan. He practiced what he preached, terminating his law partnership with Rudolf von Bertok after 15 years together. That they were also brothers-in-law didn't stop the breakup, nor did the service of von Bertok's son Leopold, Vaughan's own nephew, in the Australian artillery. The dismemberment of the German peoples was spoken of in earnest in Parliament and out. And Parliament, logical if tasteless, took the royal family's cue and anglicised the state's German place names. Out went the 100 of Homburg, named after the late Supreme Court judge, a native of Brunswick, whose sovereigns since 1714 had been the British kings, Georges and William, all ethnic Germans. Vaughan prepared a bill to arrest Germans whose sons were not at the front. Asked how many Germans in the Barossa are half English, his brother, the Premier, replied, "How many English are half Germans?" He could have been talking about King George, Rex Wallman, or the rest of them. 2 of these German lawyers enlisted, both half Gaels. Rudolf Hoitzenroder's mother was Irish, and Frederick Schultz's Scottish. Hoitzenroder was nearly 29 when he signed on in 1916. They didn't get to France until January 1918, nor to the front until May, and returned unscathed. The second was 24-year-old Frederick Balfour Schultz when he was admitted to practice in 1913, and when he was appointed an associate at the Supreme Court in June 1915. Though McBride, by July, when he enlisted in the AIF, he even resubscribed the Supreme Court roll. He embarked as a second lieutenant in early 1917, saw out the war with the 50th Battalion. German name changes were also common and voluntary. Rex Wallman dropped the second N from his surname. The patriotic gesture was appreciated. McBride's name change was less his own decision than his Sydney-born father's, who'd come to Adelaide as manager of the AMP Society. But it was a curious choice. McBride was an Irish Gaelic name. It certainly wasn't Anglo-Saxon. It wasn't even his mother's Scottish heritage. And that didn't stop wags in the profession calling him, forever afterwards, Master McSchultz. Some lawyer soldiers helped prepare servicemen for the return home. Howard Vaughan, George Lidgettwood, Frank Seymour Smith and Rudolf Heutzenroder joined the AIF Education Service. Eric Milhouse worked as its librarian, and over them Harry Thompson left the line to run the corps at Chester College. Gordon Simpson was attached to the Tidworth Barracks in the Legal Advisors branch. Welcomes home occurred, no doubt, though once again, lawyers are not conspicuous. Only Blackburn VC was feted by other lawyers on his return to practice, and that was during the war. As far as I can see, the profession didn't do anything in particular after the war. William Denny had handed over his office and his files, and also his article clerks, to Edward Benham, who was in the next room in Curry Street. And Edward Benham promptly handed them back to Denny when he returned, fully accounted for. Denny actually inserted a notice in the law list for 1914. Others expected that their colleagues would do the right thing, and a few did not. They took on clients of absent lawyers without indicating that they were acting on their colleagues' behalfs. The Law Society repeatedly directed members not to diminish soldier lawyers' chances of picking up their old practices when they returned to civilian life, and most did. Back in Adelaide during the first half of 19, most of them, a few, delayed a few more months. Gunner Edwin Cox and Private George Lidgettwood returned at their Whittington from Narracourt, embarked as a second lieutenant in the 48th Battalion in 1916. He was 27 and single, though he left behind a sweetheart. A captain by the armistice, he cabled love and Merry Christmas to Miss Pinch of Malvern. And back home by February 1919, Lewis entered law partnership with Miss Pinch's brother Alan, though nothing came of a relationship with Miss Pinch, his sister. Most returning practitioners looked for employment as managing clerks. Some soon found partnerships. Captain Gordon Campbell, MC, who had 4 years in practice before he joined the AIF, took up with Bennett, Lidgettwood and Atkinson, became a partner before long, and that firm remained one of the great, strong firms for decades afterwards. Some law firms kept a place open for departing members. Arthur Blackburn had stayed on with the firm he'd been articled to, Fenn and Hardy, and after his admission returned and was re-employed and then made a partner. More law firms restructured. Claude Martin, the son of John Martin of department store fame, left the 3-year-old firm of Wallman and Martin with only one practitioner and one clerk when he enlisted in 1915, and he didn't return after his evacuation. Instead, he joined the Crown Law, I think temporarily to fill in gaps. But Rex Wallman kept his name on the doorplate for another 3 years. Edward Padman's military duties left his Port Pirie firm of Padman and Stuart Ronald to Ronald alone. But Ronald wanted to enlist, and Padman couldn't spare him, because Padman himself was busy with war duties. Only when he could recruit James Regan, who'd been declared medically unfit, was Ronald free to go, and go he did. Pre-war practices of men like Flinders Mitchell, who did not return, were presumably absorbed by the fellows who had minded the practices. Francis Belt, post-war, lectured about his exploits and toured the world, finally setting at Montreux, where he died just before the next one. Will Denny wrote a 300-page book, The Diggers, in 1919, a book entirely in praise of the AIF. But there were other consequences. Wartime casualties take many forms. Apace with the AIF as lawyers were in many respects, 3 areas of concern to Australia's High Command scarcely blighted the lawyers' war records. Of drunkenness, absence without leave, and venereal disease, the lawyers' scores were 1%, 2%, 3% respectively. I move on. More seriously, a few were otherwise damaged and returned to lead shortened lives. Not beatifying Anzac deaths, perhaps, but still lives cut short by one of war's many guises. Lieutenant Bertram Penny and Sergeant Gordon Simpson did not recover from battlefield conditions. Penny from sunstroke, received in Egypt. Simpson from dysentery and shrapnel wounds incurred at Gallipoli. Both died of pneumonia. Penny at Keswick Barracks Hospital in 1919, aged 34, and the 44-year-old Simpson at Balmain Hospital in 1920. Saddest of all, years later, Donald Kerr's passing may have owed something to a tough year in the medical corps on the Somme in 1916. Discharged the following year, he resumed his duties with W&T Pope of Eagle Chambers, completed a doctorate on Commonwealth legislation, and married a lawyer's daughter and started a family. Yet in 1928, he died of pneumonia as a result of gas poisoning by his own hand. He too was 34. It remained to assure a collective memory of the profession's achievements and the remembrance of its war casualties. In late 1917, the Supreme Court judges took the lead in raising a memorial to the fallen and to those who served. The Law Society Council worked with their honours to design and erect an historical memento on the first landing in the vestibule at the Supreme Court. The estimate of £120 Council hoped would be met by every member contributing a guinea. It took 6 months to raise the money. This is the view you get as you ascend the staircase in Supreme Court. You get a little closer. In the middle is the name of all the members of the profession, that's people who were admitted, who served, and their various awards. On the left is the students, a very democratic touch, I think, for lawyers who are a little bit stratum bound. And on the right, those who fell, both lawyers and clerks. Glimpses into 60 lives demonstrate that South Australian lawyers certainly took a robust role in the war effort at the front and at home. I forgot to mention the Law Society's own memorial. Whether the 62 South Australians who either served or tried to, with 4 killed, reaches the national average for enlistment, rejection, active service, in branches of services entered, ranks attained, awards achieved, casualties and return to peacetime work, I'm not entirely sure. Comparisons can be odious. I think that they did reach those national averages and in some cases surpassed them. I find the legal cohort to be more Australian, more metropolitan, a little older, more established in life and career, more married, more Protestant, more private school attending, more university educated, and more commissioned as officers and NCOs than the rest of the AIF. My sense of it is that for their range of services and casualties, the state's lawyers more than held their own with the broader South Australian population. Qui procul hinc, qui ante diem periit, sed miles, sed pro patria. A man who died before his time, far from home, as a soldier for his country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for, I must say, an amazing talk, let us say. Questions from the floor?
While you were doing your research, did you find any lawyers who served in New Guinea or New Britain?
In the World War I period, no. No, I don't think any did, and I've looked at the clerks, the article clerks and the law clerks and the law students too, and no, they didn't. I think you find that was very heavily recruited out of Queensland. That's more of a surmise, but no South Australians as far as I know, no.
Very enjoyable talk.
Thank you.
Those that wanted to enlist but were refused by their chambers, could they actually have that right to deny their employees to go to war?
Not so much deny, and it wasn't, the evidence from law firms, law practices is not extant. I really can't tell you much about that. The person who was refused was really refused by the Attorney General, and he was the Crown Solicitor. I think just simply, too important to keep around. They'd just lost the Commissioner for Insolvency, who was also the Patents Commissioner. They'd just lost to death of natural causes, and they'd lost 3 of the staff from the Crown Law Office. So I think it was a case of, nice try, Tacky. His nickname was Tacky. When he was at school, he used to talk a lot, and the teachers told him in Latin, "Taque," which is shut up. So he was always known as Tacky Hannon, and that's why he didn't go. But, there's a man trying to do as what he saw was the right thing. In law offices, I think the problem with, particularly with a very senior practitioner and a very junior practitioner, they're not exactly equal partners. If the senior partner is needed for war work like Padman was, the young Ronald had to stay around. I mean, these are tiny operations, and you either wind the practice up and have nothing to come back to, or you have at least one guy stay there and keep the practice open. And that was what happened in Ronald's case, and several others. But as soon as he could recruit one of the rejected boys to come in as his partner, Ronald was free to go, and off he went. So that, there's no doubting, I think, their keenness. It's just circumstances were such that you couldn't abandon a practice entirely, because if you get down to one practitioner, that's all there is, well, you either abandon the practice or you stay home. It was a hot potato, though, as you can see. Yeah.
The other thing, by allowing them so many to go, what kind of effect did that actually have on the chambers in Adelaide? You know, too much work for too few, or did they manage? Well, I suppose they managed.
They managed is the short answer. Remember, I'm talking about military age lawyers, that's people up to 44. There was a fair number, I guess 70 or 80 in Adelaide, who would have been between 45 and 70. I think three things happened. One was that partners who would rather retire had to stay on. I know for a fact that Paddy McMahon Glynn had to write his own letters, and people always sent them back and said, please get a clerk to write your letters because we can't read your writing. So that's because his firm lost all 6 clerks. So there was a sort of a change of the way the daily grind was exercised. The other thing was the greatest single demographic change to the law office since the Middle Ages. The arrival of women with typewriters. And from 1915-16, you see the law clerks enlisting, and they always did the copper plate copying of, the deeds and what have you. And they were, literally the right-hand man of practitioners. Many practitioners really only held their heads up because they had a very good clerk behind them. By 1917, I guess, the records don't exist, but I guess it's, approaching the 50% mark. By the end of the war, the blokes are a tiny minority, and there's a half a dozen who survive, into the 30s and 40s, and then you hear about retirement parties for 78-year-old clerks who've been with the firm, 61 years and things. Yeah. So that is a very dramatic change. One woman does actually enter the legal profession in November 1917, Mary Cecil Kitson, one of the most remarkable women the state's ever produced, if I may say so. But of course she started law in 1912, so you can't really say her admission is the result of a change in the demographic of the law office. But she was well into second year when the war broke out. And you usually started articles after a year at law school. So she did a year, she should have started articles, say in December 1912, or even early 1914. She didn't, she was still in law school, because no male practitioner would take a female articled law clerk. She entered articles 3 weeks after the declaration of war. A lower middle class Catholic girl took articles with the leading mason in the state. You twig to that. He hadn't taken an article clerk in all his born days. I mean, it just doesn't stack up, except his partner had his full quota of 2 clerks and couldn't take any more. Both of them very soon enlisted, and I dare say intimated that they would enlist pretty early in the piece. Thomas Slaney Poole took this girl as an article clerk at a time when he could have waited 3 months till the November exams released a whole batch of boys. But you see, they were likely to go too. The fervour, the enthusiasm in those first months was enormous. And I think these 2 old fellas, Poole and Johnston, thought, who's the only clerk we're ever going to get who isn't going to go to the war? Choose the only female article clerk in the state. And 3 weeks after the war, she enters articles. I can't believe that that's not coincidental. I think they were looking after having some staff in the office. So in a way, the trajectory of that woman into the legal profession was confirmed. I've said all that because I saved up a picture of herself for you. So far as I know, she's perhaps better known to you as Mary Tennyson Woods. She formed the first female law partnership here in Adelaide. She left Adelaide in 1930 to go to Sydney to become a law editor, and went on to become the first Women's Affairs Commissioner for the United Nations under Doc Evatt. She was offered a peerage by Harold Macmillan in 1958, but declined. She had a son in institutional care and wanted to be nearer to him, and came home and did other things. Quite an extraordinary woman. She died in 1970.
So,
Can I ask a series of related questions?
sure, go for it.
The first is, what proportion of the lawyers who, to use the expression, took to the field, actually got the 3 medals for their service in World War I, the 14-15 Star, the Victory Medal and the British War Medal? Because that really is indicative of the number who went as fighting soldiers versus the number who went to, not to in the field, as the expression is.
Yeah. I could ask the database that in a moment. But a good half, I know, got all 3. Quite a few got 2 because they weren't there in 14-15. They didn't get the 1914-15 medal. A couple wrote letters after the war saying, "Where's my medal?" and got a letter back saying, "But you didn't actually join your unit, or you were on headquarters staff," and they went, "Oh, I'm
weren't
sure
actually
they went
on active service."
Yeah. Yes. No, I couldn't tell you.
So, because I think that's an interesting question to ask, what proportion of them actually went as fighting soldiers? The second one is, what proportion went as actually solicitors or lawyers? Because at the current time we deploy lawyers to frontline units. So we have lawyers at the moment in most of our frontline operations, and the purpose is to guide the troops as to what they can and can't do, and the rule of laws of war.
Yeah. As far as I know, no lawyers were engaged as lawyers in the war effort in World War I. All were engaged as you go into the AIF as a private, and then you take your chances as to officer allocation and also allocation to service. And they were all in either fighting or administrative roles. Whether they quietly, privately, discreetly exercised a legal role, I couldn't tell you. But it's an intriguing question, because the law of war was perhaps more abandoned in that war than any other, don't you think?
Yes, although one of our greatest soldiers was actually a lawyer.
Arthur Blackburn, do you mean?
Well, no, Pompey Elliott, actually.
Oh, right, yes.
Yes, was a solicitor.
That's true.
The final question, if I may, is where did you get the records? Because we can get the records of all the Australians who served in the AIF, and they're all there in the National Archives. Where did you get the records of the ones who served in the British Army?
The National Archives in England.
Right, they're online, are they?
No.
Yeah.
I had to visit.
Because we've got a lot of problems with the doctors who joined the British Army.
Yeah.
And the oldest doctor we've got that joined up in South Australia is Professor Watson, who joined up at the age of 65.
Yes.
And then Hayward joined up at the age of 61, and they're a whole swag in their late 40s.
That whole idea of looking at a group of the AIF, which is a vocational group, hasn't really been done. There's a major study coming out of Victorian school teachers who enlisted, and looking at what's special or different about school teachers being involved in enlistment and answering recruitment campaigns and what have you. And there's a couple of studies a bit looser than I would like, because I don't get quite what I want out of them, by a New South Wales man on New South Wales solicitors and barristers. But, there's no study of the plumbers, in the AIF, and there's no study of this or that or the other group. C.E.W. Bean, the official war historian, painted a very, very potent sort of picture of, everyone being a bushman or a rough rider from Broken Hill and so on. He rather beefed that up. But if you look at the numbers that Lloyd Robson generated in the 1970s, there's a good half to 2/3 are what we might today vaguely call white collar, all the way from sort of unskilled to professionals. It still makes them not particularly adept at being soldiers, I think. They really had to go through their training with vigour to find out what was going on.
One final comment. I'm the chair of the Army Health Services Historical Research Group in South Australia. We're preparing and it's taken us a long time to do it. We've now got 150 names of doctors who joined up from South Australia in World War I.
Wow.
And we're not quite sure how accurate that list is. And then there's this group that sit off to one side who joined the British forces. But not only are us doing it, there's a colleague of mine in Queensland who's prepared a series of books of the medical service in Gallipoli, and he's now bringing out another couple of books. So I think the medical profession are doing it, but our information base is not nearly as good as the information base that the Law Society has.
Yours is a collection at this stage. I mean, it's not published or not disseminated.
Published, no.
But the Queensland stuff is.
There's a chap from Townsville who's preparing a series of books. He's published a book on the doctors of Gallipoli.
Right. Oh, okay.
Not on a state base, but on
Thank
a
you.
national basis.
Yeah, terrific.
Right.
Apparently you do.
I note the name of Haslam,
Yes.
which is not particularly a common name. Was he a relation of Dudley Haslam, later headmaster of Queen's College, which also you mentioned at North Adelaide?
I couldn't tell you that. I'm sorry. His middle name was Horrocks, if that helps.
No, I don't. That doesn't make any connection.
I have the database here. I can have a quick look at his profile and tell you if I know something about his parentage, and that'll probably tell you, and perhaps if
I
he
would
was
be
married
interested
and his
to know.
children.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Is anyone else in the room?
Somebody
No?
knows?
No.
Ah,
No.
okay.
Actually, Peter, it was interesting.
Slam, yeah, I guess.
Slam, yeah.
They have great nicknames.
Yeah. It was interesting, one of the early lists you put up, a lot of those surnames are now reflected in hundreds in the state. Like Haslam, for example, is 100 in the state. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any
Yes,
other?
a lot of them are, oldish Adelaide family names. They're names of, some consequence around the place. I think that might be, consistent with the private school background. A lot of Saints, PAC, CBC, Sacred Heart boys, and they're, those families were around and are still around, that kind of thing. Yeah, it's quite an interesting profile socially.
Any other questions? No? Okay. Oh, well, thank you very much, Peter. It's been a most
My very
enlightening
great pleasure.
talk. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I found particularly interesting, it's nice to know what the men who went off did, but also to see what was going on behind the scenes here in Adelaide, like the recruiting and the why aren't you there, and all those, the Germans who don't know which side they're on really, and all that sort of stuff. It's reinforcing and also introducing new material. Yeah, so it's a great study. So thank you very much. If people like to show their thanks. If